It started on a calm Saturday morning. My younger sister, Emily, who's been in a wheelchair ever since the car accident, was sitting outside on the porch enjoying the sunshine. She loved watching the kids play in the neighborhood, hearing the birds sing, and feeling the fresh breeze against her face. It gave her a sense of peace and normalcy in a life where every small act of freedom was already a battle. But the homeowners association didn't see it that way. They had been nitpicking us for months. First, they said our wheelchair ramp didn't meet community standards. Then they complained that Emily's special access van took too much space in the driveway. That morning, a notice had arrived stating we had 48 hours to remove the ramp or face legal action. I couldn't believe it. A ramp wasn't decoration, it was her lifeline. 2 days later, while I was at work, Emily called me crying. The HOA had actually sent 2 so-called compliance officers who looked and acted more like aggressive cops than community volunteers. They banged on the door, shouting about fines, telling her she was breaking HOA law, and that she needed to leave if she couldn't follow the rules. Emily tried to explain, her voice trembling, that the ramp wasn't optional. It was her only way in and out of the house. But instead of compassion, they mocked her. One even said, "Maybe this neighborhood isn't meant for people like you." Those words broke her. When she told me later, my blood boiled. She was sobbing on the phone when suddenly I heard a loud knock, then shouting. That was when I dropped everything and rushed home. By the time I pulled into the driveway, Emily's face was red with tears. The 2 men were still there, standing in front of the ramp as if guarding it. My fists clenched. "Step away from my sister," I barked. They laughed, one of them flashing a fake-looking badge. "We're authorized by the HOA," he said smugly. I stood between them and Emily's chair, my voice steady but cold. "You don't touch my sister, and you don't touch that ramp." The tension was so thick it felt like the whole street was watching from behind their curtains. The men looked at each other, then one said, "If you don't comply, we'll escalate this." My heart pounded. I wasn't afraid for myself, but I was terrified for Emily. That's when my phone buzzed. A message from my twin brothers, both Navy SEALs, both home on leave, and both furious when they heard what was happening. Within minutes, a black truck pulled up. Out stepped my twin brothers, identical, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that could silence a room. Their military stance alone made the 2 HOA cops shift uncomfortably. My brothers didn't need to raise their voices. Their calm authority spoke louder than any badge. One brother walked up slowly, his eyes locked on the so-called officers. "You've got about 5 seconds to explain why you're harassing a disabled woman on her own property." The other brother leaned down beside Emily, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder, whispering, "We're here now. You're safe." The men stuttered, trying to repeat their HOA compliance excuse, but my brothers weren't buying it. "That's not law. That's intimidation." One snapped, and then, in one swift move, he pulled out his phone, dialing the actual local police. "We'll let the real authorities handle this. Let's see how your fake badges hold up then." When the real police arrived, the HOA men panicked. Their badges were exposed as fake, their threats illegal. The officers demanded identification, and it turned out these weren't even certified security personnel. They were just HOA board members pretending to have authority. They had lied, bullied, and trespassed all in an attempt to scare my sister. Emily finally spoke up, her voice shaking but stronger this time. "You try to take away my freedom just because I'm in a wheelchair, but you can't take my dignity." Hearing her say that, with tears in her eyes and my brothers standing guard, was one of the proudest moments of my life. The cops arrested the HOA bullies on the spot for impersonating officers and harassment. The neighbors, who had been watching silently, started stepping outside, murmuring in disbelief. The story was spreading fast. News cameras showed up the next day. Emily's story hit the local papers, then the national ones. The image of my sister in her wheelchair, flanked by my Navy SEAL brothers, became a symbol of standing up against injustice. People from across the country sent letters, emails, and donations to support her. The HOA board tried to cover their tracks, but it was too late. They were sued, fined, and eventually dissolved by the state for abuse of power. Our ramp stayed right where it belonged, strong, unshakable, and untouchable. Months later, I sat on the porch with Emily again. This time, she was smiling. The ramp was decorated with flowers, her van parked proudly in the driveway. My brothers had returned to service, but not before making sure she knew they'd always be her shield. Looking back, the lesson was clear. True strength isn't about badges or fake authority. It's about standing up for what's right, especially for those who can't always stand on their own. And that day, when the HOA sent their bullies, they had no idea they'd be facing not just one protective sibling, but two Navy SEALs who would never let injustice win. After the dust settled, something unexpected began to happen in our neighborhood. The same people who once peeked through their curtains, too afraid to speak up, now started knocking on our door. One by one, neighbors came forward to apologize, to admit they too had been harassed by the HOA, but never had the courage to fight back. Some were fined for planting the wrong flowers, others threatened for having too many cars in their driveway, and one elderly couple had even been told to remove the ramp to their own back door. Emily, sitting in her wheelchair with sunlight bouncing off her smile, became a symbol of quiet defiance. Her courage lit a spark in others. For the first time, people realized they weren't alone, and they didn't have to bow down to an HOA board that thrived on fear. It wasn't just my fight anymore. It had become everyone's fight. The story didn't just stop in our town. It exploded. National reporters wanted interviews. TV crews camped outside for days. And Emily found herself at the center of a conversation she never asked for, but now proudly carried. She told her story with honesty, about the humiliation of being mocked, the fear of losing her only way out of the house, and the power she felt when her family stood up for her. My brothers, usually quiet about their service, finally spoke on camera too. They explained that the fight wasn't about rules or ramps. It was about dignity and the idea that no one should abuse power over the vulnerable. Their words struck deep, echoing far beyond our little street. Soon, veteran groups, disability rights organizations, and even lawmakers reached out to offer their support. The HOA's abuse had accidentally awakened a national movement. Meanwhile, the HOA board that once strutted around like they owned the neighborhood now faced the consequences of their arrogance. Court hearings were packed with angry homeowners, armed with stories and evidence of years of harassment. Every skeleton came tumbling out of their closet. Illegal fines, forged documents, embezzled funds. The so-called leaders who had terrorized us were exposed as nothing more than bullies hiding behind paperwork. The judge didn't just fine them, he dissolved the HOA entirely. The neighborhood was placed under temporary city oversight, stripping the corrupt board of all their power. For the first time in years, people could plant flowers, park their cars, and decorate their homes without fear of a letter or a threat. Freedom had returned, and it was sweeter than anyone remembered. Emily blossomed in ways none of us had expected. With the ramp secured and her confidence restored, she began speaking publicly at schools, community centers, and veterans organizations about resilience and standing up against injustice. Her words carried a quiet strength that no badge or title could match. People listened, not just because she was in a wheelchair, but because she spoke from the heart. One evening, she told me something I'll never forget. For the longest time, I thought my wheelchair made me weaker, but now I see it. It made me visible. It forced people to show their true colors, and it gave me a reason to fight for more than just myself. I realized then that Emily had grown into something far larger than just my sister. She had become a leader, an inspiration to anyone who felt small or powerless. Emily blossomed in ways none of us had expected. With the ramp secured and her confidence restored, she began speaking publicly at schools, community centers, and veterans organizations about resilience and standing up against injustice. Her words carried a quiet strength that no badge or title could match. People listened, not just because she was in a wheelchair, but because she spoke from the heart. One evening, she told me something I'll never forget. For the longest time, I thought my wheelchair made me weaker, but now I see it. It made me visible. It forced people to show their true colors, and it gave me a reason to fight for more than just myself. I realized then that Emily had grown into something far larger than just my sister. She had become a leader, an inspiration to anyone who felt small or powerless. Years passed, and the neighborhood that was once under the shadow of a tyrannical HOA transformed into something almost unrecognizable. Where there had once been silence and suspicion, now there was laughter and cooperation. Families painted their houses in cheerful colors. Gardens bloomed freely, without fear of fines, and the annual block party, which had been banned for years, returned with a roar of music, food, and joy. Emily became the quiet heartbeat of it all. People gravitated toward her, not because they pitied her, but because they respected her. Kids helped her tend to her flower boxes. Teenagers volunteered to repair her ramp when it needed maintenance, and adults sought her advice when conflicts arose. Ironically, the very woman the HOA tried to silence had become the neighborhood's voice of reason and kindness. She was no longer just the girl in the wheelchair. She was Emily, the one who never gave up. One summer evening, the entire community gathered at the park for a special event. My twin brothers had returned from deployment, and the neighbors wanted to honor them. It wasn't an official military ceremony. It was something far more personal. Children painted banners, families brought homemade food, and an old veteran from down the street played the national anthem on his trumpet. When the twins arrived, the crowd erupted in cheers. Emily wheeled herself to the front, tears glistening in her eyes. "These are my brothers," she said proudly, her voice trembling. "They defended me when no one else would. They defended this community, too. And they defend this country every single day." The applause was thunderous, not just for them, but for everything they represented: courage, loyalty, and the refusal to bow to injustice. Over time, Emily's ramp became something more than just wood and nails. It was painted by neighborhood kids, with bright colors and words of encouragement, strength, hope, family, freedom. Visitors came from other towns, curious to see the ramp that defeated an HOA. Photographs of it were shared online, inspiring people in places we'd never even heard of. What was once threatened with removal had now become a landmark, a testament that a community united can't be broken by greed or intimidation. Emily would often smile at it and say, "Funny, isn't it? They wanted to erase this ramp, and now it's the one thing this place will always be remembered for." One night, long after the celebration had ended and the world seemed quiet again, I sat on the porch beside Emily. The stars above were countless, and the ramp lay bathed in soft moonlight. My brothers had gone inside, their laughter echoing faintly from the living room. Emily looked at me and whispered, "Do you ever think about how different life would be if we hadn't stood up? If we had just given in?" I nodded, my throat tight. Every day. But I also know this: if we had given in, we wouldn't have a story worth telling. We wouldn't have hope worth sharing. And then I realized something. The HOA thought they had power because of rules and papers. But the real power had always been ours, the power of family, of standing together when one of us was threatened, and of never letting fear dictate the way we lived. That was the lesson. That was the legacy. And that was the story that would outlive all of us. A decade passed like the turning of a page in a book. The neighborhood no longer carried scars of the HOA's tyranny. It had flourished. Homes were painted in bold colors, gardens grew freely, and every year the community held a festival celebrating independence from the old days of fear. People called it Freedom Day. And it wasn't just about food and music. It was about remembering the fight that had brought us together. Emily was no longer just a figure of resilience in our little corner of the world. She had become a well-known voice in disability rights. Her speeches were quoted in newspapers, her interviews watched by millions. She had even written a book, The Ramp That Stood Tall, which told her story in her own words. It inspired not just people in wheelchairs, but anyone who had ever felt powerless against injustice. That summer, my twin brothers returned home for a rare reunion. They were older now, their hair touched with gray, their faces lined with the quiet weight of years in service. But when they stepped into the yard, it was as if time itself had folded. Children who had never met them before ran up with wide eyes, calling them heroes. The ramp, now freshly painted in bright blues and greens, stood as the backdrop for their return. We sat together that night, the four of us, around a fire pit in the backyard. The conversation drifted between memories, laughter, and long silences that spoke louder than words. My brothers listened to Emily's stories of advocacy, with pride shining in their eyes. "You fought battles we never could," one of them told her quietly, "and you won them without ever leaving home." As the night stretched on, I looked around at everything we had built. The neighborhood children danced around the fire. Neighbors swapped stories with no fear of rules or fines, and the stars overhead seemed brighter than ever. I realized then that our fight against the HOA had become more than just a personal victory. It was a torch passed on to the next generation. Emily leaned toward me and whispered, "Do you see it? This is what we were fighting for. Not just the ramp, not just my freedom, but this life, this unity." Her words sank deep into me. She was right. The ramp had been the symbol, but the real win was the courage it gave to everyone who saw it, the reminder that no one could strip us of dignity unless we allowed it. Long after everyone went to sleep, I stayed outside by the glowing embers of the fire. The ramp stood in the moonlight, just as it had that night years ago when the HOA tried to take it away. But this time, I didn't see a piece of wood nailed together. I saw a monument, a reminder that injustice only wins if silence allows it. And in that quiet moment, I understood something deeper. The story wasn't just ours anymore. It belonged to every person who had ever been bullied, silenced, or pushed aside. It belonged to every family that had ever stood together when the world tried to tear them apart. The HOA was long gone, but the lesson remained eternal. True strength is not in control, but in compassion. Not in power, but in protection. Not in rules, but in love. As the night air grew colder, I leaned back in my chair and let the silence wash over me. The ramp glowed softly in the moonlight, no longer just a structure of wood and bolts, but a living testament to everything we had endured and overcome. It was a reminder carved into the soul of our home, whispering that courage is not measured by the size of the battle, but by the heart of those who choose to fight it. I thought of Emily, sleeping peacefully inside, her breath steady, her strength quiet yet unshakable. I thought of my brothers, warriors who carried scars the world would never see, but who never hesitated to stand between their family and danger. And I thought of myself, not as a hero, but as a witness to what love, loyalty, and unity could accomplish when the world tried to break us apart. The HOA was gone, their names forgotten, their power erased. But the story, the legacy, remained. It lived in every laugh that echoed through the street, every flower planted without fear, every child who ran freely across the yards that once carried warning signs. It lived in Emily's smile, in my brother's pride, and in the bond of a family that had proven unbreakable. And as I sat there, staring at the ramp one last time, I knew the truth with absolute certainty. Some battles end when the enemy is gone, but others live on forever, not as wounds, but as reminders. And our reminder was clear. Real power isn't in tearing others down. Real power is in lifting them up. That night, under the starlit sky, I realized our story would never truly end, because it had become part of something greater, something eternal. And that was enough.